Hi guys, today we're gonna talk about one of the most common misunderstanding about the squat, which is why you should not bring your knees out in a squat. I believe you have heard this cue before. People are asking you and telling you that, oh, maybe you should keep your knees out when you descend. I understand why some of you guys will go into this kind of mentality and mental cues. It's because here are some of the reasons, obviously. The first one is you guys have difficulty hitting the depth. So when you guys have difficulty hitting the depth, you will try to compensate by bringing the knees out, and then you will assume that with the knees out position, your hips can sit lower and hence you can hit the depth, okay? The second reason why you guys will think about and assume this cue is because you guys are a little bit more obsessed with thinking about engaging the glutes at the start of the lift or throughout the whole motion of the lift. This is not what we believed in, because in a squat it's all about the control of the bar as well as the usage of your knee extensors, right? The third one is when on the way out of the squat, so you guys go down and on the way out of the squat, your knees start to cave inward, alright? So when your knees start to cave inwards, you start thinking, oh shit, my knees are not going outwards. So you started cueing yourself even more with the knees out. The problem is not from the knees, the problem is actually from the foot itself, which will bring it up all the way to the glutes. We will discuss about that later. And the last reason why you guys like to create that knees out cue is because most of us, or some of you guys, are afraid of hinging, meaning sitting back or leaning forward in a squat, to a result where you want to try and keep yourself as upright as possible, but you have limited ankle dorsiflexion. That's why you have to keep your knees out to create sort of that range of motion, but actually you're hurting yourself more than ever. Alright, so I've shown you all the reasons, and if you are one of them, you have to continue to watch this video, because we are gonna help you understand why this is not an appropriate cue for you and a possible solution you guys can take. But before that, let JJ explain to you what's going on at the bottom of a squat.
Hi guys, this is JJ. So I'm just going to briefly explain the sort of biomechanics regarding what happens in the bottom of the squat and why knees out is probably not such a great idea for most people, as well as why it's a bit overrated as a cue. We're not saying that this doesn't work. It should be a universal cue that you should never push your knees out. But we're gonna just explain to you and show you from a biomechanics and a perspective why knees out might not be such a great idea. First and foremost, for a lot of people, they think that driving their knees out would, try to help them to sort of create depth, as well as at the same time, driving their knees out will help them to feel their glutes. So this is not a good idea, because first and foremost, when you drive your knees out, especially in the bottom of a squat, it's actually a mismatch of what is happening at the hip. Generally speaking, from maybe about 90 degrees, plus and minus 30 degrees either way, so about 60 to 120 degrees of hip flexion, which means you're bending your hip. What happens is your hip is actually starting to bias into internal rotation, right? So driving your knees out is obviously the opposite of that, which is external rotation. And to show you this, we're just going to use a really simple example. What I'm going to show you is, in this position, if you look at my knees, right, and I'm straight up and down. This is 0 degrees of hip flexion, right? And then as I start to bend my hips, right, you can see that if you look at my knees, if I start to sit back, you can see that my thumbs actually start to rotate in. Right, so imagine you're getting to the bottom of a squat and you're hinging and you're sitting into it. So you can see how my thumbs start to roll inwards, right? So that's actually an internal rotation at the hip. In order for you to be able to hit depth, you need to internally rotate at the hips, right? So what happens when you can't internally rotate is most people will try to compensate by driving their knees out. And what we think is an issue here is likely not because you cannot internally rotate, but because you have created some sort of structural change up the chain at the hip, at the rib cage, and even at the foot, so that you're fixing your hip in a certain position and forcing you not to be able to access that range of motion. So the most common things we see are hyperextension. The most common things we see is some issues at the foot, and we have videos of this. We have both an issue of how, I think our first video was how to brace so that you're not hyperextended and then having to force your knees out. And then secondly, we also have a video of how to control your foot arch. So what we're gonna talk about is, because now that you know that your hips are meant to internally rotate, you are not trying to force your knees in as a result, but what you're trying to do is to make sure that your knees are just tracking normally and letting your knees track naturally over your toes. As we talk about, sort of squatting and in deep hip flexion, we need to understand that pushing your knees out is also not a good strategy, because when you drive your knees out, you actually, and you are in that deep hip flexion movement and you're coming out of that movement, as you drive your knees out, you actually force your adductors in a position which doesn't allow them a good position to pull, right? So some of the times you will see that people, when they come out of the hole, you'll see their knees come in and then they'll go out again. So this is not valgus. I repeat, this is not valgus. A true knee valgus is when your tibia, so your lower leg, and your upper leg sort of rotates in different directions. Whereas an internal rotation of the hip is where your knees and your tibia and your foot all move in the same direction. We're not asking you to touch your knees together when you come out of the hole. We want to see that control, and usually if you fix your brace as well as your feet, most of the time that solves itself. All right, I'm going to hand it over to Adam, and he's going to talk you through some of the cues that we've previously spoken about that will help you with some of the issues without having to cue knees out.
Hey guys, Adam here from Technique Matters. So the best way to approach this is to work from the bottom up. First one we want to work through is feet rooting. What feet rooting is, we've done a video on this previously, but we'll go through it again, is that you're thinking of your feet as a claw, so your big toe, little toe and heel. You think of an eagle or a hawk, they'll claw it like this. This is the sensation, what you want to feel when you're about to squat, okay? So what this does, it helps engage your glute med. You don't essentially need to really try and feel for it, but with correct rooting, it will help engage your glute med throughout the squat and help with better knee control. How do we root our feet? So what you want to do is just to think of just clawing your big toe down and your little toe down, right? And then just plant your heels down, okay? And then from here, you're gonna just set up your brace, correct bracing, and then come down into the squat. By doing this, we'll go into our next step. By doing this is gonna help control your knees throughout the movement. You won't need to think about your knees throughout the squat, because with the correct rooting, your knees will go in a natural squat pattern and help engage the proper muscles throughout the squat, which is your quads and your hamstrings. The last thing that you wanna look out for is to make sure the bar is traveling mid-foot. When you're warming up your squats or when you're filming your squats, it's best to shoot some or video your squats from the side so you can look at your bar travel. What you want to see is the end of the bar traveling towards your midfoot. If the bar's not traveling towards your midfoot, then you're not optimizing your squat, okay? So by adjusting your positioning and correct rooting, will get you in a better position throughout the squat. Okay, so lastly, I just want to add the importance of correct bracing. We've gone over this previously in our previous videos, but I'm just going to add this in here as a reminder. When you're bracing, you want to make sure that your hips and rib cage are in a neutral position, okay? So you want to think of your pelvis and your ribs as a cylinder or like a soda can. And what this does is when you correctly brace, you have a neutral position like this, and it's harder to break that brace, okay? So if you can imagine if there was like a dent in the soda can and you went to put pressure on it, it's gonna fold, right? That's the exact same concept when you come to bracing, okay? So make sure you're bracing correctly. With correct bracing and correct rooting and correct bar path, this will optimize your squat. Okay guys, I hope you enjoyed this video. If you liked the video, make sure you share around, make sure you like, subscribe if you haven't already, and we'll see you in the next one. Bye.